Number 1. Matthew Coleman. There is a special kind of darkness that hides beneath a blinding, righteous light. We want to believe that evil always looks the part, that it announces its arrival with a sinister whisper. But the terrifying truth is that the most dangerous monsters often carry a Bible and a perfectly warm smile. Before we dive into the chilling details of this first tragedy, I must warn you about the sheer devastation of the cases ahead, especially the sixth and final story. That final case is so deeply unsettling, so utterly brutal in its calculated betrayal, that it will fundamentally change how you view trust. You will definitely want to stay until the end for that one, because it defies all human comprehension. If you value true crime stories that dig deep into the psychology of the unimaginable, please take a brief moment to subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering these dark truths together. Now, let us return to the sun-drenched shores of Santa Barbara, California. It was the summer of 2021. Matthew Coleman was the picture of the American dream. He was a beloved surfing instructor, a passionate religious influencer, and a man who seemingly worshipped his young family. He and his beautiful wife were raising a 2-year-old boy and a 10-month-old baby girl. To the outside world, their life was an endless reel of beach sunsets and pure joy. But beneath that golden veneer, a toxic and deeply delusional storm was quietly brewing inside Matthew's mind. He began spending exorbitant amounts of time falling down internet rabbit holes, trading traditional scripture for unhinged conspiracy theories. Have you ever looked at someone whose life seemed perfectly orchestrated, only to wonder what terrifying secrets they were hiding from the people who loved them most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because the mask Matthew wore was absolutely flawless. He smiled for the cameras, preached about love, and all the while, he was quietly convincing himself of an invisible apocalyptic war.
The transformation did not happen overnight, but when the final snap occurred, it was catastrophic. Matthew began to experience what he described to others as profound religious visions. These were not messages of peace or spiritual grace. Instead, they were dark, violent premonitions, fueled by bizarre online forums and extremist QAnon rhetoric. He started to believe that the world was being secretly controlled by a nefarious cabal of non-human entities. More terrifyingly, he began to look at his own flesh and blood, his tiny, innocent toddlers, not as gifts from God, but as vessels of an ancient evil. By August of 2021, the delusions had entirely consumed him. Without uttering a single word of warning to his wife, who frantically called the police when she realized her family was missing, Matthew loaded his 2 young children into his van. He did not pack for a family vacation. He drove relentlessly southward, crossing the international border into Rosarito, Mexico. As those poor children sat in their car seats, trusting their father entirely, the man driving them had already sealed their fateful destiny. He checked into a hotel, biding his time as the coastal sun dipped below the horizon, replacing the light with a suffocating darkness. Put yourself in the shoes of a mother waking up to an empty house, her frantic calls going straight to voicemail, her heart pounding with instinctual dread. If the person you trusted most in the world suddenly vanished with your children, would your first thought be that they were in danger from a stranger or from the protector themselves? Tell me what you think below, because the betrayal of a parent's duty is a specific kind of waking nightmare. Matthew was no longer a father in his own mind. He had twisted himself into a holy warrior. He believed he was the only one who could see the truth, preparing to commit the ultimate sacrifice under the twisted guise of saving humanity.
When the sun rose on the sleepy Mexican town, the unspeakable had already been done. Matthew Coleman had taken his 2-year-old son and 10-month-old daughter to an isolated agricultural ditch early in the morning. There, he brutally ended their brief, innocent lives. When he was finally apprehended by federal agents while attempting to cross the border back into the United States, his demeanor was chillingly calm. He did not deny the murders. In fact, he confessed with the eerie tranquility of a man who firmly believed he had done a righteous deed. He told investigators that through his visions and deep dives into QAnon theories, he had learned that his wife possessed serpent DNA and that she had passed this monstrous genetic trait on to their children.
He looked federal agents in the eye and claimed that his toddlers were going to grow up to become literal monsters, and that by slaughtering them, he was actively saving the world from destruction. He used the name of God to justify the cold-blooded execution of a baby and a toddler. The surfing instructor, the loving husband, it was completely obliterated by a horrific combination of unchecked mental illness and radical online indoctrination. When a human mind fractures so deeply that it confuses the slaughter of infants with divine salvation, can we ever truly call a prison sentence justice? Drop a comment below and tell me your exact perspective, because this psychological abyss is something that haunts every investigator who touches this case. Matthew believed he was a savior, but he was nothing more than a monster himself, leaving behind a completely shattered widow. Yet, as terrifying as it is when a single father loses his mind to internet prophecies, it is perhaps even more chilling when a patriarch commands an entire household to embrace death as their only salvation. Somewhere in Central California, a self-proclaimed prophet was ruling over his isolated family with an iron fist, and when authorities finally came knocking at his door, he decided that if he could not keep his 9 children, then nobody in this world ever would.
Number 2. Marcus Wesson. That self-proclaimed prophet in Central California was a man named Marcus Wesson, and the bloodbath he orchestrated inside his Fresno home remains one of the darkest days in the city's history. Wesson was not merely a father, he was a man who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. He did not just run a household, he built a secluded, tyrannical cult right in the middle of a seemingly ordinary neighborhood. He systematically convinced his family that he was a divine figure, a literal prophet ordained by God to lead them through a wicked world. How does a man successfully convince an entire family that his twisted, oppressive word is actually the infallible voice of God? Let me know your theories in the comments, because understanding that sheer level of psychological manipulation is truly terrifying. He controlled absolutely everything they experienced, dictating what they wore, what they ate, and who they were permitted to speak to. The women and children were deliberately isolated from the outside world. He weaponized Holy Scripture, violently twisting the beautiful concept of family unity into a dark, unbreakable, and deadly pact. He ingrained in his children's young minds from the very moment they could understand him that the outside world was purely evil, deeply corrupt, and determined to tear their sacred family apart. He explicitly taught them a chilling philosophy that if secular authorities ever tried to intervene or separate them from him, the only acceptable escape, the only honorable path to spiritual salvation was death. It was a ticking time bomb of severe paranoia. The house itself became a terrifying fortress of secrets, a prison keeping the prying eyes of society completely shut out. Imagine living every single second of your life under the suffocating gaze of a man who claims he holds the keys to your eternal soul. If you were born into a nightmare where the only truth you ever knew was fed to you by a tyrant, do you think you would ever have the strength to recognize the abuse? Drop your thoughts down below, because for the children trapped inside that house, questioning their father was framed as a direct rebellion against God himself.
The fateful day arrived in March of 2004. The fragile, isolated bubble Wesson had built finally burst when estranged family members, absolutely desperate to rescue their own children from his draconian grip, arrived at the Fresno house accompanied by local law enforcement. It was initially supposed to be a standard custody dispute, a relatively routine intervention by Child Protective Services to ensure the safety of the minors living there. But for Marcus Wesson, the terrifying sight of police officers in uniform outside his window was the exact apocalyptic scenario he had been preaching about for years. The secular world had finally come to tear his divine kingdom apart. Instead of surrendering like a rational man, Wesson immediately locked the doors and barricaded himself inside the house with his devoted followers. A tense, agonizingly slow standoff ensued. The police negotiators tried everything in their power to coax him out calmly, tragically unaware of the fatal brainwashing that had taken deep root behind those silent walls. When the police surround a building, we naturally assume that the arrival of authorities means immediate salvation for the victims inside. But what happens when the hostages have been methodically programmed to believe that the police are the actual demons? Tell me in the comments how you would even begin to negotiate with victims who are heavily brainwashed to welcome death over rescue. It is a chilling psychological puzzle with no easy solution. Inside that dark, suffocating home, Wesson was not preparing to physically fight the heavily armed police outside. He was calmly preparing to fulfill the morbid promise he had made to his distorted God. He gathered his deeply terrified but completely obedient family members close to him. He had spent decades systematically stripping away their natural human survival, and unity could only be preserved in the afterlife. The standoff dragged on for hours, the silence from the barricaded house growing heavier and significantly more ominous by the minute, masking the absolute slaughter happening within. When the tactical teams finally breached the doors and entered the residence, the horrific reality of Wesson's unchecked power was revealed in the most gruesome way imaginable. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. Inside a back bedroom, officers discovered a scene that would forever haunt their nightmares. 9 young people, ranging in age from just 1-year-old to 24 years old, lay dead in a massive tangled pile. They were his own children, individuals he had fathered and manipulated. They had all been shot. Wesson had successfully executed his dark prophecy, violently ensuring that the outside world could never take his family away. But the most sickening twist of this entire tragedy was Wesson's ultimate cowardice. After slaughtering the people who worshipped him, after vehemently preaching that death was the only righteous path for their family, Marcus Wesson did not take his own life. He calmly emerged from the house, his clothes stained with the blood of his children, and surrendered to the police without a single scratch on him. Why do you think these self-proclaimed prophets so eagerly demand the ultimate, bloody sacrifice from their loyal followers, yet prove entirely too cowardly to face that very same fate themselves? What does that sheer hypocrisy truly reveal about their so-called faith? Sound off in the comments, because his survival is a profoundly bitter pill to swallow. Wesson used the name of God to mask his obsessive need for total control, choosing to annihilate 9 innocent souls rather than relinquish his twisted power over them. He was ultimately sentenced to death, a hollow victory for the vibrant lives he so ruthlessly stole. But while Wesson's bloody reign was stopped by a police raid, another deeply pious man managed to execute his entire family under the absolute guise of saving their eternal souls, only to calmly lock the front door, turn off the lights, and completely vanish like a ghost for nearly 2 decades.
Number 3. John List. That ghost who completely vanished into thin air after annihilating his own bloodline was a deeply religious man named John List. The year was 1971, and the setting was a sprawling, opulent 19-room Victorian mansion known as Breeze Knoll in Westfield, New Jersey. To the outside world, John List was the absolute epitome of conservative respectability. He was a stern, uncompromising Sunday school teacher, an accountant who wore impeccably tailored suits, and a man who demanded rigid adherence to religious doctrines within his home. His family, his elderly mother, his wife, and his 3 teenage children were expected to project the flawless image of a devoted, devout Christian household. But behind the heavy wooden doors of that massive estate, John was drowning in profound financial ruin and paralyzing shame. He had secretly lost his job and was siphoning money from his mother's bank accounts just to keep up appearances. More terrifying to his warped mind than poverty, however, was his belief that his family was slipping away from his strict religious control. His wife had stopped attending church, and her teenagers were wanting to embrace the changing secular culture of the 1970s. Have you ever known someone so completely obsessed with their outward reputation that they would rather destroy everything behind closed doors than admit a single flaw to the public? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because the pressure John put on himself was entirely self-inflicted, yet he made his family pay the ultimate horrific price. Instead of humbly asking for help or admitting his catastrophic failures to his congregation, John concluded that the only way to protect his family's eternal souls from the creeping sin of the modern world was to send them directly to heaven. He truly believed that a life of poverty and secular temptation was far worse than a violent, untimely death. And so, with a chillingly calm and entirely sober mind, this pious Sunday school teacher meticulously planned the total eradication of the very people he had sworn before God to protect. The morning of November 9th, 1971 was crisp and ordinary. It did not begin with a fiery argument or a sudden explosive fit of rage. It began with the terrifying, methodical precision of an accountant balancing a fatal ledger. After his children left for school, John List walked up behind his wife, Helen, as she drank her morning coffee and shot her in the back of the head. He then walked upstairs to the third-floor apartment and shot his 85-year-old mother, Alma, directly above her left eye. There was no panic. There was no frantic call to the authorities. What is truly the most chilling aspect of a murder? A sudden, blinding crime of passion? Or a killer who can calmly make himself a sandwich in the very same house where his family lies dead? Please share your perspective in the comments below, because John's complete lack of emotion is absolutely paralyzing to consider. After executing his wife and mother, John simply cleaned up the kitchen. He drove to the bank to cash in his mother's savings bonds, and then he returned to the silent mansion to wait. As his children, 16-year-old Patricia, 13-year-old Frederick, and 15-year-old John Jr., arrived home from school one by one throughout the afternoon, their father ambushed and murdered them. He even drove to John Jr.'s soccer game to watch him play before bringing him home to face his execution. He dragged their lifeless bodies into the grand ballroom of the mansion, arranging them neatly on sleeping bags in a grotesque display of morbid order. He then meticulously cleaned the crime scenes, mopped the blood from the hardwood floors, and went about erasing his own existence. He systematically moved through the massive house, carefully cutting his own face out of every single family photograph so that the police would not have a recent picture of him to use for a wanted poster.
Before he walked out the door and vanished into the cold November night, John List turned on the mansion's intercom system, setting it to play a religious classical music station on a continuous loop. He left a 5-page letter addressed to his pastor neatly resting on a desk. In that chilling confession, he did not express remorse. Instead, he calmly explained that the 1970s were simply too wicked, that his family was straying off the righteous path, and that he had murdered them out of love to ensure their souls would safely reach heaven before they could commit any unforgivable sins. He weaponized his faith to justify the slaughter of his entire bloodline. The bodies lay undiscovered for nearly a month, while the eerie classical music echoed through the decaying, freezing halls of Breeze Knoll. John List successfully disappeared, assuming a new identity, joining a new church, and eventually marrying another unsuspecting woman. He lived as a free man for 18 agonizingly long years before he was finally recognized from a forensic bust aired on a television show. How does a man attend church every single Sunday, sing hymns of praise, and look into the eyes of a new wife, knowing his previous family is rotting in the ground by his own hand? I need to hear your psychological theories in the comments, because the ability to completely compartmentalize that level of evil is deeply disturbing. He used God's name to play the role of a savior, but he was nothing more than a cowardly executioner running from his own pathetic failures. Yet, as horrifying as it is to see a man wipe out his family in a single bloody afternoon, there is a distinctly different brand of terror in a man who takes his time. There are some pillars of the community who perfectly play the role of the devoted Christian husband, only to quietly and ruthlessly eliminate their wives and children over the course of multiple decades, the moment they become an inconvenience to his perfect life.
Number 4. Robert Spangler. That pillar of the community who quietly and ruthlessly eliminated his family over the course of multiple decades was a man named Robert Spangler. He was the ultimate chameleon, a man who built his entire existence around the projection of a flawless, God-fearing Christian life. He was a Sunday school teacher, an active church volunteer, and a widely respected public relations professional. To the outside world, his first marriage to his wife Nancy was a picture of wholesome middle American domestic bliss. They shared 2 beautiful teenage children, Susan and David, and their home in Arapahoe County, Colorado, was the quintessential hub of suburban respectability. But behind his warm, practiced smile, Robert Spangler harbored a chilling emptiness. By 1978, he had grown profoundly bored with his family. He simply wanted a fresh start, a life free from the responsibilities of a wife and children. But in his rigidly curated social circles, a messy public divorce would completely shatter his pristine, righteous reputation. Have you ever encountered someone who values the opinions of their church congregation more than the actual lives of the people living under their own roof? Please share your thoughts in the comments, because Robert's terrifying logic is almost impossible for a normal human mind to process. Instead of facing the embarrassment of a failed marriage, he decided that becoming a grieving widower would elevate his status and protect his holy image. And so, on a quiet winter morning just after Christmas, this devoted family man walked downstairs with a .38 caliber revolver. He shot his wife Nancy as she sat at her typewriter.
He then walked upstairs and executed his 16-year-old daughter Susan and his 17-year-old son David right in their own beds. He meticulously staged the scene to look like his wife murdered the children and took her own life, leaving a typewritten suicide note with a forged initial. He played the role of the devastated surviving patriarch so perfectly that the authorities, blinded by his stellar reputation, closed the case exactly as he had scripted it.
Robert Spangler successfully manipulated the justice system using the heavy shield of his pristine Christian reputation. He attended the funerals, accepted tearful condolences from his congregation, and transitioned into a new life. He was a free man, entirely unburdened by the family he had so easily discarded. Over the next decade, he remarried and continued to play the role of the devoted, active church member. But the terrifying truth about a chameleon is that they never truly change their nature. They only change their surroundings. By the spring of 1993, Robert was on his third marriage, this time to a vibrant woman named Donna. And just like before, the novelty of the relationship eventually wore off. He grew tired of her, but once again, the prospect of another divorce threatened to tarnish his image as a stable, God-fearing gentleman. How terrifying is it to consider that the person sleeping next to you, the person praying beside you in a church pew, might be quietly calculating the most convenient way to erase your existence? Drop your thoughts below, because Donna had absolutely no idea she was married to a cold-blooded annihilator. Under the guise of a romantic spring vacation, Robert suggested a trip to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. He carefully guided his wife away from the crowded tourist areas and lured her to a deeply isolated, treacherous spot along the canyon rim. He asked her to pose for a photograph, smiling at her through the camera lens as she stood dangerously close to the precipice. With the same chilling detachment he used to pull the trigger 15 years earlier, this so-called pillar of the community stepped forward and violently shoved his wife. Donna plummeted 200 feet to her death, her life brutally extinguished on the jagged rocks below. Once again, Robert played the flawless role of the heartbroken survivor. He rushed to the authorities, painting a tragic picture of a clumsy, fatal accident, leaning heavily on his reputation to deflect any lingering suspicion.
For decades, Robert Spangler moved through the world as an untouchable man. He used the cover of personal tragedy and the unwavering respect of his religious peers to mask the soul of a prolific serial killer. He believed he was vastly smarter than the police, and for a long time, he was entirely correct. The Arapahoe County murders remained officially closed, and the Grand Canyon Fall was legally recorded as a heartbreaking accident. It was only in the late 1990s when a relentless group of cold case investigators finally began to connect the deeply suspicious dots of his tragic life that the carefully constructed walls of his holy facade began to crack. But even then, the authorities lacked the hard physical evidence needed to arrest a man whose reputation was so heavily insulated by his community. It took a terminal cancer diagnosis in the year 2000 for Robert to finally drop the mask. Knowing he was going to die anyway, and perhaps feeling the terrifying weight of his impending mortality, he coldly confessed to murdering his 2 wives and his 2 teenage children. When a man who uses faith to cover up his crimes only confesses when he is staring death directly in the face, do you believe it is genuine repentance, or just a final desperate act of cowardice? I would love to hear your perspective in the comments. Robert Spangler was a man who slaughtered his own flesh and blood simply because he was afraid of what the neighbors might think, proving that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one sitting in the front pew. He twisted the concept of a God-fearing life to serve his own selfish vanity. Yet, as chilling as it is when a man murders to protect his social standing, there is a vastly darker realm of delusion we must explore. Imagine a deeply respected preacher who does not murder to hide his sins, but rather slaughters his own wife because he truly believes that God himself whispered in his ear and demanded a blood sacrifice.
Number 5. Chris Kjeldsen. That deeply respected preacher who truly believed the Almighty demanded a brutal blood sacrifice was a man named Chris Kjeldsen. The year was 1989, and Chris was a man whose identity was entirely consumed by the pulpit. He was not just a casual believer, he was an intense, fiery preacher who captivated his congregation with powerful, thunderous sermons about sin, redemption, and the necessity of divine purification. To his loyal followers, he was a spiritual lightning rod,
a man who possessed a direct line to the heavens. His wife stood quietly by his side, the very picture of a devoted, supportive partner in his holy crusade. But behind the heavy, closed doors of their private life, a deeply terrifying and dangerous psychological unraveling was taking place. Chris was becoming increasingly obsessed with the archaic concepts of biblical sacrifice. He began to twist the metaphorical teachings of his faith into a literal, horrifying obsession with blood and purification. He spent hours agonizing over his own perceived impurities, spiraling into a dark, suffocating delusion that he was deeply tainted by the sins of the modern world. How does a man whose entire life is dedicated to preaching the gospel of love and forgiveness suddenly pivot to believing that the only path to grace is through extreme, unspeakable violence? I want you to drop your thoughts in the comments below, because the sheer velocity of his mental collapse is absolutely staggering. He was no longer reading scripture for spiritual guidance. He was actively scouring the texts for a justification to commit the ultimate atrocity. He convinced himself with a chilling certainty that he had received a direct, unmistakable command from God himself. The divine voice echoing in his fractured mind did not ask for deep prayer or fasting. It demanded something infinitely more precious, telling him that the only way to completely wash away his suffocating sins was to physically sacrifice the devoted woman who loved him the most.
The tragedy of this case lies in the blinding trust his wife placed in him. When a man is universally revered as a holy leader, the people closest to him are often the last to recognize the encroaching darkness. She likely noticed his erratic behavior, the intense, sleepless nights he spent pacing the floors and muttering about his overwhelming guilt and need for extreme cleansing. But in the context of their deeply religious household, she may have simply interpreted his descent into madness as a period of intense spiritual warfare. She was sleeping next to a man who was quietly, methodically preparing to become her executioner, completely unaware that his fervent prayers were actually preparations for a gruesome slaughter. Imagine lying in the dark beside your spouse, a person you believe is a beacon of moral virtue, while they are silently calculating the exact moment to end your life in the name of God. If the very person society trusts to guide their souls suddenly becomes the ultimate predator, where do we even begin to look for safety? Share your psychological perspective in the comments, because the betrayal of a sacred marital vow mixed with twisted religious fervor is a particularly paralyzing nightmare. When the fatal moment finally arrived, Chris did not act in a sudden, blind frenzy of secular anger. He acted with the terrifying, deliberate precision of a priest performing a grim, ancient ritual. He truly believed he was stepping into the shoes of the biblical patriarchs, commanded to offer up his most beloved earthly tether. He violently murdered his innocent wife, silencing her life not out of hatred, but out of a severely distorted, psychotic desire for his own spiritual elevation. He convinced himself that her spilled blood was the literal currency required to purchase his absolute purity. The house, once filled with the echoes of his passionate sermons, was suddenly transformed into a silent, gruesome altar of death. He stood over her lifeless body, not as a grieving husband, but as a man who believed he had just successfully passed the ultimate test of faith. When the authorities finally discovered the horrifying scene, Chris Kjeldsen did not attempt to flee into the night or craft a convoluted web of lies to protect his physical freedom. He surrendered to the police with an eerie, unsettling calmness that sent shivers down the spines of the seasoned detectives. Sitting inside the bleak, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, he looked directly into the eyes of the investigators and openly confessed to the brutal slaying. But it was not a confession born out of earthly remorse. He boldly declared that God had explicitly commanded him to perform the execution. He explained with complete and terrifying sincerity that sacrificing his wife was the only acceptable method to purge his soul and guarantee his absolute cleanliness before the Lord. He firmly believed that the mortal laws of men simply did not apply to a man who was following the direct verbal orders of the Almighty. When severe mental illness perfectly masquerades as divine inspiration,
how can the justice system adequately punish a man who fundamentally believes he has committed a holy miracle rather than a heinous murder? I need you to dive into the comment section and tell me exactly how you would judge a killer whose reality is so utterly divorced from our own. Chris Kjeldsen was ultimately stripped of his pulpit and locked away, his legacy forever cemented as a monster who used his faith to destroy his own family. His story is a chilling reminder of the absolute destruction that occurs when religious fanaticism fully eclipses human empathy. Yet, as deeply disturbing as it is when a preacher loses his mind to psychotic delusions, it is perhaps infinitely more terrifying when a prominent religious figure is completely sane. The most brutal betrayal of all happens when a trusted church leader, desperately trying to protect a massive, lucrative public image and hide a secret affair, coldly decides to orchestrate an elaborate hoax, blaming the slaughter of his own family on an invisible, phantom stalker.
Number 6. Christopher Coleman. That trusted church leader who orchestrated an elaborate phantom stalker hoax to hide his own sinister betrayal was Christopher Coleman. In the spring of 2009, Christopher was living what appeared to be the ultimate blessed life in Columbia, Illinois. He was the highly paid head of security for one of the most famous televangelists in the entire world, Joyce Meyer. He traveled the globe on private jets, protecting a massive religious empire and returning home to a beautiful, devoted wife named Sherry and their 2 young, vibrant sons, Garrett and Gavin. To the congregation and their tight-knit community, the Colemans were the absolute pinnacle of Christian success and domestic harmony. But behind the impeccable suits and the righteous smiles, Christopher was hiding a deeply selfish and destructive secret. He was engaged in a passionate, illicit affair with a woman who lived in Florida, and he was desperately looking for a way out of his marriage. The problem was that his prestigious, lucrative career hinged entirely on his moral standing. In his strict religious organization, a divorce, especially one born from infidelity, meant immediate termination and public disgrace. He would lose the money, the status, and the lavish lifestyle he felt he deserved. Have you ever wondered what happens when a person's greed completely overpowers their basic human conscience, transforming them from a protector into a predator? Please share your thoughts in the comments, because Christopher's next move is the definition of cold-blooded calculation. Instead of simply walking away from his family and accepting the consequences of his actions like a man, he decided that his wife and children were expendable liabilities. He began planting the seeds of an elaborate, terrifying lie. He started receiving anonymous, threatening emails, warning him that his family was in grave danger if he did not stop traveling for the ministry. He showed these threats to his wife, his employer, and the local police, brilliantly playing the role of the terrified, targeted family man.
The psychological torture he inflicted on his wife before he ever laid a hand on her is almost too monstrous to comprehend. Sherry Coleman spent the last months of her life living in a state of absolute, paralyzing terror. She was afraid to be alone in her own home, constantly looking over her shoulder for a faceless stalker who wanted to destroy her family. She clung to her husband for safety, entirely unaware that the monster she feared was the very man sharing her bed, the man secretly typing those horrific death threats from his own laptop. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated evil required to hold your terrified wife as she cries, promising to protect her from a phantom danger that you created solely to cover up your upcoming crimes. If you had to look into the eyes of a partner who is manipulating your deepest fears just to set the stage for your murder, do you think you could ever sense the lie? Let me know your perspective in the comments below, because Sherry trusted Christopher with her life, and he weaponized that trust against her. The horrifying climax of his cowardly plan unfolded in the early morning hours of May 5, 2009. Under the cover of darkness, while his family slept peacefully in their beds, Christopher crept through his own home. He did not use a gun or a knife. He used his bare hands and a chilling, intimate violence. He brutally strangled his beautiful wife, Sherry, extinguishing the life of the woman who had stood by him for years. Then, he walked into the bedrooms of his own flesh and blood. He strangled 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin as they slept in their beds, violently ensuring that no witnesses would be left behind. To complete his gruesome masterpiece, he grabbed a can of red spray paint. He defaced the walls of his own home with vile, threatening messages, deliberately incorporating the name of God and profane language to
to perfectly frame his imaginary, religious-hating stalker.
After orchestrating the slaughter of his entire world, Christopher drove to a local gym to establish a rock-solid alibi. From the treadmill, he casually called his neighbor, who happened to be a police detective, and asked him to check on his family because they were not answering the phone. When the police entered the home and discovered the devastating bloody scene, Christopher arrived and put on an Oscar-worthy performance of a shattered, grieving husband. But the very arrogance that allowed him to commit these murders was ultimately his profound undoing. He thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was incredibly sloppy. The red spray paint on the walls was still fresh and wet when the police arrived. Even more damning, the threatening messages scrawled across the house contained the exact same unique spelling errors and grammatical mistakes found in the anonymous emails he had sent to himself. Why do these arrogant, narcissistic killers always believe they are intellectually superior to the seasoned detectives who investigate homicides every single day? I want to read your theories in the comments section, because his absolute confidence in his own lives is mind-boggling. It did not take long for digital forensics experts to trace the IP addresses of the stalker's emails directly back to Christopher's own laptop and his secret burner cell phones. The facade completely crumbled, exposing a deeply pathetic man who valued a secret affair and a high-paying security job far more than the lives of his devoted wife and 2 innocent little boys. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, completely stripped of the religious glory and wealth he had murdered to protect. Christopher Coleman used the name of God to paint a fake enemy on his walls, but the only true demon inside that house was him. These 6 tragic stories force us to confront a chilling reality. The darkest evils do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, they are standing right behind the pulpit.